Welcome, everybody. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the executive director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have so many people with us today. It's a really fun and exciting day to talk about a new, powerfully argued and wonderful book by two longtime friends of AHS and people whose work speaks for themselves, but who've been grateful enough also to talk with a lot of students over the years. The book that we're here today is to discuss is called Danger Zone: The Coming Conflict with China. When I woke up this morning, I promised myself I'm not going to make any Top Gun jokes or references because I'm sure these guys have gotten enough of them. So maybe they'll weave them in themselves. It's the two authors of today's book. First on my, I don't know, up or left or down, I don't know where the screen is for you, but is Dr. Hal Brands. Hal Brands is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Beyond all his books that he's written, including one we hosted a few months ago called The Twilight Struggle, he's also a weekly columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. And so you can find Hal's writings at AEI, at SAIS, at Bloomberg, and Foreign Affairs. I don't know where else, or maybe it's better to count the places Hal has not published in, and he's joined by his co-author, Dr. Mike Beckley. Dr. Beckley is Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and also a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His first book, which we also did a book talk for in the pre-COVID days, way back, was called Unrivaled: Why America Will Remain the World's Sole Superpower, which was published in 2018. And while obviously today's book is focused first mostly on Chinese dynamics and then what the United States could or should do about it, I think it's part and parcel with Mike's previous work and obviously Hal's work as well. So thank you both for joining us today and look forward to diving into the book. One note to the audience, we'll hopefully have a little bit of time for a question or two at the end. If you want to, just find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, submit the question in writing, and then when I call on you, I will figuratively hand you the microphone, which basically means unmute you and you'll get to ask your question directly rather than interpreted through me. So with that, why don't we start at the very beginning? Because I think the whole argument that your book makes takes on a bit of the conventional wisdom in, let's say, in the academic literature, as well as a lot of the conventional wisdom in Washington on kind of great power competition, which we expect. So maybe you can just start us off briefly, which is, what is your thesis? What is it that you're arguing, and why is it a little bit different than what most of us expect or see out there?
Well, I'll take a crack at that, and thank you, Gabe, for having us. It's always fun to have a chance to talk about this stuff with you. I think the way that we think of this book is it's kind of a counterintuitive contribution to the let's hyperventilate about China school of analysis. And so, yes, we should be hyperventilating about China, but maybe not for the reason that you think. And so the argument of the book is that China is actually more dangerous than many American observers realize, because China has more problems than many American observers realize. You referenced the conventional wisdom, Gabe, and I think the conventional wisdom for a number of years has been that China is the next global superpower. It's destined to replace the United States as the world's number one at some point in the coming decades, perhaps the coming years, and that what we're witnessing is a power transition between the hegemon of the 20th century, the United States, and the hegemon of the 21st century, which is China. We think that's wrong. We think that China is unlikely to surpass the United States as the global hegemon for reasons that Mike spelled out in his first book, and also for reasons that we talk about in this book. Namely, that China's best days economically and strategically are already behind it. It's confronting a future of economic stagnation because it's facing a host of structural obstacles that will be very difficult for the Communist Party to overcome. And we can talk in more detail about what those are. But the short version of it is that basically all of the tailwinds that propelled China forward in the post-Mao era have now turned into headwinds demographically, economically, politically, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, it's facing a world that is more and more resistant and perhaps resilient to Chinese assertiveness and Chinese ambition. More and more countries, particularly advanced democracies around the world, have concluded that China's assertiveness is bad for business. It's bad for the international order that the United States created and that it and its allies have sustained over the past 75 years. And so they're willing to do more and more to frustrate Chinese ambitions. You can see this in groupings like the Quad or AUKUS, which are basically multilateral coalitions to constrain China. You can see it in the way that countries in the Western Pacific and beyond are retooling their militaries for the prospect of a clash with China. You can see it in the ways that Western economies are starting to wall off parts, key sectors from Chinese technological or economic influence. And so the result of all this is that China is going to struggle to achieve some of the great ambitions that the Communist Party has laid out for it. It's going to struggle to dominate Asia militarily or to become the world's most prominent power. But what that means is that China may actually become more risk prone, more risk acceptant in the near term. There's a long pattern of this historically. When revisionist powers, countries that want to reorder the international system, start to worry that they are running out of time to do so, that they're peaking and starting to decline relative to their competition, they often become more aggressive. And so that's what we worry about in the context with China today. And the title of the book, Danger Zone, relates to this idea that this is where we're headed with China, that the second half of this decade in particular is going to be a period when China is very tempted to use greater levels of coercion and force than it has been in the past, precisely because it realizes that it has limited time in which to achieve its goals.
So two questions kind of flow from that, and either of you could take it or you can kind of split them up however you feel. So the first is, Hal, you kept talking about China and some of the problems that China has, as you both lay out in the book, obviously are deeply structural in that way and long term. So my first question is, do you see the distinction or is your thesis make a distinction between, let's call it China, and some of the structural things that you mentioned and so forth, or the kind of the individual mindset of the current Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and what that means in terms of how they view it? So that's kind of one. And the second that flows from that is, does perception matter here? Are you saying that Xi Jinping or top CCP leadership share your analysis, see the things that you see, and therefore, in order to forestall those things, are going to actively engage in more risky or aggressive behavior? Or are you saying that these are trend lines that just shape everything that people do, and so they may not even realize it, but they will start behaving in such a way that affirms sort of the underlying analysis that you kind of laid out?
I'll maybe take a stab at the second question. I think there's two things going on. One is just, regardless of what Chinese leaders think, for a number of structural reasons, this is sort of a moment of opportunity, simply because the military balance, I think, is very likely to shift by the 2030s, just given the fact that Japan is doubling defense spending, the fact that the United States seems more dedicated about ramping up its capabilities in East Asia, that the Taiwanese are doing the same, and that China has just come off the end of this epic period of shipbuilding and loading up on ammo, and now it has to take care and repair and maintain all of those platforms that it's built. And so it probably is not going to be able to sustain the same level of trajectory unless it makes a big investment. So regardless of what we think about what Chinese leaders are saying, part of our argument is just that there is these vulnerabilities on the US and allied side that need to be plugged, just because there is an opportunity there. But I actually do think that we try to present a fair amount of evidence that Chinese leaders are well aware of all of these problems. Not surprisingly, these are front page news around the world. And obviously, if you just look at, you have to separate the propaganda that comes out of Beijing. You can't, when people say, well, Xi Jinping says the East is rising and the West is declining, it's okay, well, yeah, but that would be like looking at the president's State of the Union address and using that to gauge where the United States is at any moment, right? If you actually go behind the curtain, we cite internal speeches that Xi Jinping has given to his cadres where he's warning them of a Soviet-style collapse that could be triggered by economic crises. We cite internal government reports that have been leaked out that vividly describe all of the same problems that we highlight in the book: the debt, the diminishing returns, the demographic, environmental crises. We cite leaked CCP guidance documents. So these are documents that are coming from the top leadership to millions of cadres that are warning about hostile Western forces that are trying to bring the party down and that essentially have to be eradicated. And I think it's notable that China has come out with a new national security strategy. So in 2015, China released its first national security strategy, and it's in internal speeches. Xi Jinping explained that the reason he was doing this was that China faced, quote, the most complicated internal and external factors in its history. It was confronted by increasing threats and challenges. To underscore the point, he actually quotes from the Book of Changes, which is this ancient Chinese text from the Warring States period from 500 to 200 BC, where China collapses into bloody violence. And then we just note that, China's just doing things that don't exactly betray a super confident superpower on the make. The fact that the government has essentially outlawed negative economic news unless it's explicitly sanctioned by Beijing. The fact that Chinese elites are trying to emigrate from the country in vast numbers and getting their children and their money abroad. The fact that Chinese middle-class citizens are protesting and not paying their mortgages on half-built apartments. And of course, the fact that the government is building the most sophisticated, sweeping internal security apparatus the world has ever seen. So we just think there's a lot of evidence building up that the CCP leaders see the writing on the wall. It's not that they're throwing their hands up saying, woe is me. In fact, they're saying, we can change this, but we have to move boldly and quickly in order to do it. We think they've already done it in a number of ways. The big industrial policy they've rolled out, the Belt and Road Initiative, the huge shipbuilding program. I mean, these all suggest that they are not willing to part with their ambitions and are going to act on them.
So I'm happy to take a crack at the first question, but I am kind of curious what the woman behind you thinks she may have wandered into here. Mike, you're going to have a crowd of people interested in international affairs surrounding you at Reagan.
I was going to say the surveillance state has gotten much more sophisticated.
So if you see things going on behind me, if there's like a CCP agent ready to disappear me, please let me know before I get dragged away.
So Gabe, I think it's, it may be even useful to break down the entities we're talking about one step further, right? And so you can think about China, the country, you can think about the Chinese Communist Party, the political party that runs the state, right? And then you can think about Xi Jinping, the guy who runs the CCP and has been exerting greater personal political control over it and the state as well. All of these are important actors in the analysis, right? And so if you're just thinking about kind of China's level of ambition, well, Chinese leaders have thought about China or the various empires that make up were once what we would now call China. Think of it as sort of the world's leading power, certainly Asia's leading power for centuries or millennia, right? And so when Xi Jinping talks about the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, he's actually talking about a strategic tradition that goes back deep in Chinese history before even the CCP emerged, right? When we talk about the CCP, we're talking about a Leninist party state, right? That is basically identifies its own well-being with the well-being of the Chinese nation and inflects Chinese foreign policy in ways that are consonant with the political control of the CCP and the people who run the CCP. And then, of course, there's Xi Jinping, who's a remarkably ambitious leader in his own right. The point that I think we would make is that even though so much of the debate around Chinese foreign policy today is centered on Xi Jinping, will he get a third term? Spoiler, yes, he will, right? Which way is he pushing Chinese foreign policy? It's a mistake to think that we have a Xi Jinping problem. We have a China that is led by the CCP problem. It's very difficult for a democratic superpower to get along well with an autocratic power that worries that the norms of the liberal international order could be fatal to its illiberal control of the Chinese political system at home. And there are lots of ideological elements that have figured in the CCP for a long time that predispose the party toward a hostile view of the United States. And so, in fact, CCP elites have always thought that the United States was trying, whether sooner or later, to overthrow the CCP and overturn the Chinese political system. And so there's a degree of built-in hostility in the relationship. But it's a mistake to think also that Xi Jinping has nothing to do with it. He does have something to do with it. He has accelerated the trend toward greater assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy, even though that trend predates him. It dates back to Hu Jintao in the late 2000s. And he has certainly done things which lead American observers to worry that he may increasingly identify his own fortunes with the fortunes of the Chinese state. And so just one example of this would be, it used to be the formulation of Chinese leaders that China could wait 100 years for Taiwan to come back to the mainland's control. Xi Jinping does not have that formulation. He has a different formulation where he basically says this is not a problem that should be passed down from generation to generation. Now, the way that is sometimes interpreted by China watchers is Xi Jinping saying, it should not be passed down to the next generation of Chinese leaders. In other words, I want to solve this on my watch. Now, that's not a universally accepted interpretation. There's some dispute around it, but it certainly appears as though Xi Jinping has a willingness to go fast and go hard in areas where his predecessors might have been more constrained. And so some of the tensions we see in US-China relations today do reflect Xi's personal influence on the political system, on Chinese foreign policy, even though the root of the problem goes much deeper.
I was gonna say, I mean, the perennial question of does the moment shape the man or the man shape the moment is obviously a difficult one to disentangle, but it sounds like you're saying it's a little bit of both in the sense that he has personal ambition, all those things, but at the same time, one of the factors that is, as you put it, accelerated China's greater assertiveness already over the last 10 years is, his analysis or sense that they have negative trend lines and they need to do something about it, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's right. And so, in previous stuff, I've sometimes said that Xi Jinping is an effect as much as a cause. And so even if Xi Jinping wasn't around, you might have gotten somebody like Xi Jinping at something like this stage in China's development, because China had developed greater capabilities to be influential on the world stage. It was confronting sharpening dilemmas between continued economic reform and the maintenance of CCP control of the political system. And so it's entirely possible that a different leader might have made similar choices. That said, there's always contingency. Individuals always play a very important role in history. And so we don't want to make it sound as though this is a purely structural analysis, because you can point to various ways in which Xi has changed the way the CCP does business.
Well, that's why I want to follow up on that and something Mike said earlier, which is, on the one hand, you're pointing to all these structural trend lines and so forth. On the other hand, as I'm sure you both would agree, and you kind of say it a little bit this way in the book, which is a neo-totalitarian regime is always going to be insecure about its status. And the leader of that regime is always going to be personally insecure about his status within that regime, or in this case, within the party in particular. And so no matter what the trend lines, even if they were the inverse of what you're assessing them to be, they'd still be concerned about controlling the behavior and sometimes the thoughts of their own people. So the question for you is, what would it look like? And I understand counterfactuals are tough. If the trend lines weren't what they would China still be, or under Xi Jinping still be trying to assert itself in a greater way? Would it still be trying to clamp down on its population in the same way? And that these trends, these structural trends, are just exacerbating, kind of the deep-seated aspects of these regime? Or at some point there was a pivot? Again, is it 10 years ago, 5 years ago? Is it now that has led them to say, we really need to put our foot on the gas right now because we are concerned about the dynamics that you're talking about?
I think we actually look at events like the 2008 financial crisis, which was one of several turning points, because up until then, China's economy is booming. It's growing at 10 to 15% a year. And other countries, because there was just so much demand to try to make money in China's market, opened up. They paved the way for China to integrate into international organizations. And so China, in that kind of environment, could actually adopt a peaceful rise strategy. They could wrench concessions, territorial, for example, in the case of Hong Kong or Macau from Portugal and Britain, a dozen other countries settle their territorial disputes with China to curry favor with Beijing. Another half dozen or so change their recognition away from Taiwan towards Beijing, again, to try to curry favor with a rising power. And so, when you have a booming economy and things seem to be going in your direction geopolitically as well, you can afford to take a patient and peaceful approach, because you can always just assume the next days, the coming years, the coming decades will be better and will be stronger than we could before. We can hide our light and bide our time. And so we really think that the slowdown in the economy, the strategic pushback plays a role and has fundamentally altered the decision calculus in Beijing. And there's many different dates that have been important to this. I think the 2008 financial crisis is important because China was so dependent on exports, and when you have the financial crisis, a lot of its main export markets just don't have the demand. They're not buying as much Chinese stuff. There's more protectionist sentiment, and at the same time, China has to turn to stimulus spending and industrial policy to try to stimulate and prop up its domestic economy, and that just drives it in a fundamentally different direction. They also start desiring to cultivate new export markets, which I think ultimately results in Belt and Road, because they say, look, we can't just rely on the Americans, the Japanese, and the Europeans to endlessly buy a glut of Chinese goods, nor do we want our companies to become cogs in a machine that's dominated by Western multinational corporations. We need to start carving out our own privileged economic zone. And so they started doing that through what has eventually become the Belt and Road Initiative. And you can also trace it through changes in the security environment within China itself. You know, some of this actually starts under Hu Jintao. A lot of the major pieces of legislation that have enabled the expansion of the Chinese security state take place beginning under his watch and then are expanded under Xi Jinping. And again, I think this has a lot to do with China's trajectory. If China was still growing rapidly, they could rely on economic performance to bolster the legitimacy of the CCP. They would always be a repressive state, but would they have to build this sort of Orwellian apparatus and put, you know, more than 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps if they could just throw money at the problem? Probably not. But as economic times have gotten tough, as they're getting more international pushback, they have to start taking more hardcore measures. And this is why we just worry. China has always had the same high objectives of expanding its power internationally, but now it just has fewer peaceful options of seeing those through, and is now using more coercive methods.
Well, and just I want to push on this because I think it actually really is really important. When you guys talk about danger zone, you're talking about from the perspective of the United States primarily. The United States faces a danger zone in terms of a time horizon because of the things you lay out. Is there a second danger zone that she sees, not because of the external dynamics, as you point out, but because exactly as you said, which is if the social contract, let's say, is, you know, improving socioeconomic welfare in exchange for limited individual rights, and, you know, the economy stagnates, and as a consequence, there's a greater middle class unrest, or they're not making the gains that they made in the 90s into the 2000s that way, that the CCP's danger zone is actually internally into its rule as opposed to externally and unable to meet its global ambitions. And the corollary to that, I guess I would say, is why do you think that this would lead them to be more aggressive externally? Whereas one could also imagine a scenario where they actually withdraw and say, just as they did in their own history, obviously in the 50s and 60s, and say, we need to focus internally because that is by far the greatest threat to our rule.
So I think the danger zone from the Chinese perspective, it encompasses both internal and external developments. And so certainly the 2030s look pretty nasty internally for the Chinese regime, because you're going to have a deepening demographic crisis that makes it harder and harder to generate prosperity. You're going to have a continuing trend toward economic stagnation. You're going to have growing strains on the political system, as you have, for instance, a smaller and smaller number of workers that are trying to take care of a larger and larger number of retirees, right? And so is this going to lead Chinese citizens to rise up and revolt and overthrow the CCP? That's not what we're predicting. Nobody knows what the answer to that question is. I think it's kind of unlikely. But what it will do is it will create a sense among Chinese leaders that they face deepening internal problems that do not have obvious solutions within the framework of a CCP-dominated political system, because many of the things that China might do to, say, reinvigorate its economy would involve undermining pillars of the CCP regime, right? Sort of cutting away the crony capitalism relationships that sustain the regime. So that's part one of the danger zone. Part two is that in the 2030, I think the world is going to look pretty nasty from a Chinese perspective as well, because you've already seeing more and more nations that decide that they are in some form of competition with China and are reorienting their policies accordingly. If you look out to the 2030s, that's when a lot of the military modernization programs the United States is undertaking now are going to start to mature. It's when Taiwan will presumably be done or nearly done implementing its new overall defense concept, which would make that island a much tougher nut to crack. If you look at the trends in the Indo-Pacific, you're likely to have a much more concerted coalition pushing back against Chinese assertiveness and so on and so forth. And so I think the world is going to look uglier from a Chinese perspective as well. And that gets to the point or the question that you raised, Gabe, which is, well, when that happens, why do you push forward instead of pulling back? And this is where history comes into play. I mean, Mike has done a great study of this as part of a related project where he basically looks at every instance of a fast rising country that was growing at a rate markedly higher than the global average for 7 years, something like that, and then slows down dramatically. And what we find is that they rarely just mellow out and accept decline. They ended up doubling down on domestic repression. They end up doubling down on overseas expansion. And they do that in an effort to try to reinvigorate their economy by carving out economic and technological spheres of influence. They do that because they worry that they have antagonized powerful enemies while they were rising, and they're going to be at the mercy of those enemies once they start to decline. They see their enemies sort of closing in around them, and they make desperate lunges to try to break the ring. You can see that there are a lot of parallels to Germany's situation prior to World War I, a lot of parallels to Japan's situation prior to World War II. And so what we worry about is a situation where China thinks that, say, the medium to long-term future looks pretty bad, but that it actually has a promising window of, say, military opportunity in the second half of the 2020s, because the military balance in the Western Pacific and the Taiwan Strait's going to look pretty good for China at that point if current trends continue. And so why don't we move fast to try to lock in gains now, especially if those gains can help us avert longer-term deterioration in the balance of power. And so you can tell yourself a story if you are Xi Jinping, where if you are successful in grabbing Taiwan, you break the first island chain, maybe you rupture America's system of alliances in the Western Pacific, you get all the military advantages that come from incorporating Taiwan into the PRC's power projection and defense efforts, and so on and so forth. And so maybe you end up with a dramatically improved strategic situation that helps you hold back the forces of decline. It's not clear that's what would actually happen, by the way, if China were able to take Taiwan. It might just lead Japan to decide to build 80 nuclear weapons over the course of a few weeks, because now Japan faces a dramatically deteriorated environment. And so it's entirely possible China could come out of this in a very messy place. But the simple act of aggression would have dramatic global ramifications, which is what we worry about and why we're trying to make the argument the United States needs to move much faster to deter this sort of thing while it still can.
You obviously spent the last couple chapters in the book kind of laying out some of those recommendations, although maybe one psychological warfare recommendation might be trying to convince China that it is more powerful than it actually is at the moment, so that it might forestall that opportunity and last a little bit longer and get us to where we need to go. The book does a really good job, and both of you in your own work did a really good job using, I think, history as a way to create analogies. Analogies are always a little dangerous, but to use history as a way to inform how we should think about the present. And obviously throughout the book, the media's chapters are looking at the Cold War for dynamics that you've both written about separately. The moment or the era of maximum danger, the danger zone in that conflict you lay out is actually in the immediate period after World War II, is the mid to late 40s through the kind of mid 50s. And that the United States had to engage in a series of strategies and a series of actions that flow from it in order to sort of forestall or put off the worst, in order to then settle into a longer term dynamic that was more in the United States' favor. And I guess it's hard for folks at the time to kind of know. My guess is the Eisenhower administration didn't sort of like put its feet on its desk in 1955 and say, all right, we're good, we're fine. But that's essentially the argument I think that you're making. So my first question for you both on that is, are you suggesting that the Soviets were actually peaking in the late 40s, early 50s, and that it was based on, because I think that's not where the traditional kind of literature talks about. And so could you kind of talk a little bit about how you separate, at least in this example, the concept of a danger zone and the time horizon versus, and I think we only kind of knew this in retrospect, but most now I think studies will say that the Soviet economy sort of started stagnated in the late 1960s, but we didn't even realize it for another 20 years. So I wonder if you could kind of unpack the economic stagnation or the peaking question, which I think underpins a lot of your argument here, with the kind of danger zone concept using that historical analogy.
Yeah, I think there's two separate kind of historical tracks in the book. There's the history that Hal just went through of all the actually peaking powers. The Soviet Union, we don't include them as one of them, simply because their growth rates, while high in the 50s and early 60s never reached the kind of gangbusters type growth that we look at in these actual peaking powers. It did, obviously go on some offensives in the 70s and early 80s that might be consistent because that's when its growth was declining and it was starting to get more pushback after detente falls apart. But we don't really turn to it for those historical lessons. The reason we look at the Cold War is simply because there aren't that many good cases of recent great power competition that we can draw on. And in a lot of those peaking power cases, you would almost use them as examples of what not to do because there were just so many disasters. They weren't managed well. And so when we were looking for lessons to draw, the one that jumped out to us was just the early Cold War, just simply because you had this worry of a short-term threat that could throw off the long-term trends that were largely favorable. So like American policymakers in the early Cold War were fairly confident that communism ultimately would prove bankrupt, but they worried that in the short term, it was on the march because you had the Soviet military deployed across a shattered Eurasia. You had communist parties that were starting to gain vote share even in Western Europe. I think they were winning up to 30% of the vote share in certain Western European countries. And so there was just this specter of a danger zone then. And we think that there's a rough analogy just in the very broad sense to today, and just in the sense that in the long term, the trends are relatively favorable for the United States and its allies vis-a-vis China, but there are these short-term risks. And so just like then, there's a couple of recommendations you can draw. One is just that, we have to recognize that time is short. We can't just think of competition with China as this 100-year marathon. There's going to be this shorter, sharper phase this decade. And that means we need to do a number of things fast to kind of plug holes in our deterrent barrier, use assets that we have on hand now. Hal, has written extensively, as one of the foremost historians of the Cold War, has shown that things like the Marshall Plan and NATO, that we think of these long-term brilliant schemes to win a long-term Cold War, were actually kind of slapped together in a matter of weeks and months. And in reaction to fast evolving crises, we think that you need something similar like that today in, say, the Taiwan Strait, where you need to surge shooters and sensors there. You need to quickly put together an economic bloc to prevent China from dominating parts of the global economy, and basically creating the Amazon effect, where it's like the sole or main producer of certain key goods, whether it's computer chips or PPE or rare earths. You do not want to give China that kind of leverage. So you have to move quickly to plug those holes. And then second, we also draw lessons about not overreaching, again, from the early Cold War, that if you recognize that the long-term trends are favorable, that means you don't have to necessarily oppose your adversary everywhere at all times. You're just trying to get to the long game. And so we look at something like the Domino Theory and how it's taken out of hand, and this idea you have to stamp out communism everywhere. That could be sort of replicated in a similar way today if the United States is literally trying to compete with every Chinese tunnel and road built along the Belt and Road, or trying to wipe out Chinese influence across the global South. I think it's much more important to focus on near-term victories China could score that would upend those long-term favorable trends for the United States and its allies. And that was a similar logic that leaders in the early Cold War deployed. So we just thought it was loosely a useful analogy.
Yeah, maybe I just add something briefly here. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there are, every competition has a rhythm, and there are different stages in every competition. And so you can have a competition between great powers that lasts for 45 years, but the degree of danger of military conflict waxes and wanes considerably over the course of that period. And the degree to which the outcome of that competition is seriously in doubt, in the sense that it can truly go either way, may also wax and wane over time. So when we talk about the US-China competition, the argument is not that, we get to 2030 and everything's great. Even if we get to 2030, having successfully deterred China from overturning the balance of power in the Western Pacific and doing all sorts of other nefarious things, there's going to be an ongoing competition with a stagnant but still dangerous China that will go on for years and years and years and maybe decades, right? And so maybe it will be a superpower marathon, but you've got to win that sprint in order to ensure that you prevail in the marathon, to stretch the metaphor a little bit. In the Cold War, you're absolutely right, Gabe, right? And so, Eisenhower and Dulles and Kennedy and they did not think the United States had it made in the shade after the Marshall Plan and NATO were rolled out. And in fact, it took a lot of continuing exertion and investment to make sure that the Cold War came out the right way. And so one of the things that's very clear is one reason why the Soviets are not more tempted to lash out during the 1980s when they realize that the Cold War is slipping away from them is because the US has invested in these alliances and these deployments and this system of extended nuclear deterrence that just makes clear that aggression will only lead to catastrophe for the Soviet Union. There's no formula by which it makes the Soviet position better, right? And so that took 2 generations of effort of investment to produce. That said, if you want to look at the period where the United States was most seriously in danger of losing the Cold War, it was in the late 40s and early 1950s, right? Because that was when the balance of power was very fragile. It was where, absent a few key decisions and a few good breaks, you could have seen large swaths of Eurasia fall under Soviet control, whether formally or informally. And so by the time you get to the early 50s, you actually do see policymakers like Dulles saying, hey, you know, the status quo isn't terrible for us. We're going to have to work like hell to preserve it, but we've tied the key industrial areas of the world to us through our alliances. We've helped them recover from wartime devastation. And so now we're moving into a different stage of this conversation, still very difficult, still very dangerous, but one in which if we can basically hold what we have over time, we may be okay in the end. And that's, I think, the loose analogy we're thinking about today.
How do you, and I don't want to get into a long riff about the Thucydides trap, although I know that will make Hal particularly happy, but how do you distinguish between the behavior, let's call it, of a peaking power and the behavior of a declining power? I mean, I would, a lot of the behavior you're describing, I would say you're describing Russia today over the last 15 years. You know, economic problems up the wazoo, demographic problems, you know, very few friends around the world. And what do we see? Military opportunism, if not aventurism, in that vein of the last 15 years. I think most would classify Russia as a declining or declined power rather than a peaking power. So how do you distinguish these two things? And again, without getting into the traps of the Thucydides trap itself.
I think when peaking powers aren't handled well, even once they become declining powers, they can still cause trouble. So we actually look at Russia as one of our cases because Russia was a resurgent power in the 2000s. You know, it was racking up 8% economic growth rates every single year, largely because of high oil prices and obviously coming out of the trough of the post-Soviet collapse. But then after oil prices declines after 2009, they start to drag down Russia's economy and Putin's popularity with it. And that's when he starts turning to look for ways to revive Russia's fortunes, in particular by starting to put a lot of a pressure on former Soviet states to basically join a Russian-dominated customs union. He's basically asking them to become economic vassals of Russia, and that sets up a showdown with Ukraine, a big part of which wants to go with the EU and sign this comprehensive trade deal. And that's the origins of the 2014, you know, annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Eastern Ukraine. And then that has then paved the way for the disaster that we have today. So even though Russia has now, I think, firmly moved into the declining power camp, it's still living in the legacy of that peak of its power that resulted in the initial foray into Ukraine.
So even as kind of Hal stated, that even if we make it through this danger zone, and we know we have the prospects of a long Cold War with China, it could even be a long Cold War with China as a declining power, you know, after, right, it has peaked along the lines you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And so we now know in retrospect that the Soviet economy peaked relative to that of the West, you know, the United States in particular, probably around 1970, give or take a year or two. There were 2 full decades left in the Cold War after that, right? And so that's the sort of, you know, mindset we have to be in today, that yes, we may find ourselves in a position where the long-term trends really favor us if we can get through the remainder of this decade. But that doesn't mean that you can, you know, as you put your feet up and relax. There's still going to be a lot of competition to come.
So let me ask, I've got 2 more questions and we'll turn to a couple questions from the audience. So the first is, how will we know that we have successfully made it through the danger zone? How will we know that we have run the gauntlet? We've taken a little bit of beating, but that we have emerged generally unscathed of the worst case consequences, and thus can be more prepared to do things on our terms? Is it simply the absence of a Chinese attack on Taiwan that in of itself would do? I know I'm asking the sort of like the dog that doesn't bark sort of question, right? But like, how do you see it as in your book, you talk about various time periods. You're talking about 2035, I think is the number you guys put out there, I think. But how do you see it that in the moment do it, especially as, we just discussed, obviously, Eisenhower, Dulles, they didn't sit around and sort of like, wipe the sweat off their brow and say, all right, guys, like, we're good for now.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, in part because even historically, people disagree about the degree of danger there was of, say, a Soviet invasion of Western Europe at different phases of the Cold War, right? And so it may be that even looking back 20 years from now, it's hard for us to identify, if we're successful, exactly when the danger of, say, a Chinese assault on Taiwan peaked and started to wane. But I think, we lay out kind of 3 markers in the book of things that the United States needs to achieve to feel as though it has come through the danger zone. And one is not simply avoiding an attack on Taiwan. It is creating a military balance in the region that would make an attack foolish to the point of being politically suicidal for Xi Jinping or whoever succeeds him. And so it's a state where, Taiwan has a greater capacity to defend itself. The United States and its allies have greater capacity to come to Taiwan's aid. And we feel pretty good about how a U.S.-China conflict in the Western Pacific would play out. And we're fairly confident that the Chinese understand that it would be really bad for them as well. There's a lot of subjectivity in that, of course, right? But that's one marker. The second marker would be that China's bid for a technological empire encompassing much of the third world, the global south, or whatever you want to call it, is frustrated, right? And again, that will be something that's difficult to measure precisely, but we'll be able to take a look at the end of this decade and figure out, how many countries have used Chinese providers for 5G telecommunications. Are smart cities that are powered by Chinese surveillance technology becoming more or less ubiquitous, and so on and so forth. So there are rough metrics you can use to figure out how you're doing here. And then the third one, which is maybe the most nebulous, is trying to ensure that China is not successful in sort of poisoning and corrupting and coercing democracies around the world in the way that it's been trying to do increasingly and with greater aggressiveness in recent years. That one, I think, is going to be harder to judge and say, okay, we're successful in doing this, because the measures of success are inherently a little bit more nebulous. But those are the 3 areas where, if we can make real progress during the coming decade, I think we can feel much more confident about how this competition is ultimately going to play out, assuming we don't let our guard down after that.
What's last question I could go, but last question for me, at least at this phase. What's been the reaction to your argument? I mean, I know I've seen some of your own colleagues at AEI, kind of issue some friendly critiques, or at least I hope they're friendly inside the building of your work. But I'm actually more curious about, do you think that the Biden administration, or at least the Biden Canada Asia team, do they share your assessment that actually the moment of maximum danger is actually this decade, not the next one or the one after, and that China is actually a peaking power? Have you seen anything in Beijing that suggests that they've read your work and maybe they've said, "Geez, golly, these guys are right. We really got to move on it," or the opposite, which is like, these crazy Americans are sowing conspiracy theories about how we are past our prime already? I'm just kind of curious what you've seen in terms of the reaction to the argument.
I think on the Chinese side, I sort of wear it as a badge of honor. There's been a number of state media articles talking about what idiots we are and how we've completely underestimated China. There was a bunch of stuff like that when my first book came out.
And I'm sure I'm sure your answer is only half true, right? So I mean, it's only Hal's part that fits into that conundrum.
I deflect as much criticism as possible and take as much credit as possible, just in general. I think there's, we've also been called into the Chinese embassy to, get a lecture about how we're, stirring up trouble. So clearly the Chinese don't like the message that we're sending. In terms of,
but it means they've read it. It means they've read it, though.
At least some elements, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have read it. I don't know if it's gotten to Xi's desk or not. Sometimes I worry, that it could actually catalyze the exact kind of problems that we're talking about. So maybe that's all for the better. In terms of just more broadly, I think it's just the full gamut of reactions. And so we see this as just trying to say, look, this is an important debate that needs to be had. Most people still think of the rise of China as this long-term challenge that has to be dealt with, but there are these short-term periods, these moments of danger. In terms of the influence in the Biden administration, I'll let Hal speak because he's much more plugged into the Beltway, but I do know that, folks like, Colin Call, like, what, number 2 or number 3 in line at the Pentagon have, talked in these exact words. They're high-level Pentagon officials and people at the top of the intelligence community that I don't know if it's because of our work, but probably because of, the highly classified information that they're privy to, where they're also very worried about, for example, a Chinese assault on Taiwan in the next 5 or 6 years. So there are certainly elements at the highest levels of government that buy into this, but there's also folks that I know of in the Biden administration that at least came into the administration thinking of the competition with China as a long game, and writing books to that effect. So I can't really speak to how influential it's been. Hal is probably more privy to this kind of conversation.
I mean, it wasn't that long ago that if you suggested that there was a serious danger of war between the US and China in the near to medium term, and say a 3 to 4 year period, people would look at you like you were insane. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think if you look at the remarks that Avril Haines has made, if you look at some of the comments that have come out of Indo-PACOM over the past couple of years, you can slice it and dice it in different ways, but basically you see more and more recognition that the threat of major Chinese military action in the Western Pacific is acute, or whatever word you want to use, in the coming years, whether next 5 years, next decade, whatever the case may be. So there's clearly a growing recognition that this could be a near-term rather than a long-term problem. But I think the official thinking is probably still a little bit muddled or contested on this issue, because if you look at what capabilities DoD is developing and procuring and fielding, it still appears to be more primed to let's get ready for trouble in the early 2030s rather than let's get ready for trouble today. And I think that actually points to a couple of things that are worth noting and worth being empathetic to decision makers about. One is that this is a hard analytical problem, right? We have confidence in the argument that we're making. Wouldn't make it if we didn't believe it, but it's a hard analytical problem. And anybody who gives you a precise date at which we should be most scared about China, I mean, look, there's obviously some amount of guesswork involved in that, because if something happens, it may be touched off by an event that neither side expected or understood, like a visit by the Speaker of the House to Taiwan, or whatever the case may be. The second part is that there are real serious implications to making the sort of analytical bet that we're making in this book, right? And so if Mike and I say we think the moment of peak danger is from here to the end of the decade, and we're wrong, then it's embarrassing for us, but we're academics, we're used to embarrassment, life will go on. If policymakers make that bet and they get it wrong, and that comes at a detriment to our ability to modernize and prepare for a conflict in, say, 2033 or 2035, there are no kidding real world consequences to that. And so I think it's kind of intellectually and bureaucratically difficult for policymakers to say, oh, okay, right, we accept this argument, we're going to motivate and mobilize to deal with this particular period of danger, and in doing so, we're going to accept risk in other time windows. I think that the tendency, for understandable reasons, is probably to be a little bit more muddled and to hope that we can deter and prevail across all time frames, even though that's obviously a lot harder than it sounds.
So let's go to questions, and we have a question here from Steve Began, but I think he dropped off. So let me just kind of read it. Former Deputy Secretary of State. His question is: if we want to see the continued or even accelerated decline of a CCP-led China, what should we, the United States, do more of, and what should we do less of? And if one of you wants to do more of, the other can do the do less of category.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. And on one level, I think it would be good for the United States to have an accelerated decline of a CCP-led China. because I don't like the way that the CCP runs China. I don't like the way that the CCP conducts Chinese foreign policy in the world. And so if we were able to get beyond that, that would be great. On the other hand, I think it's important probably to be clear, what exactly we're talking about. If we're talking about trying to hasten the decline of the CCP-led regime, well, that's that would be a big gamble. It's not clear that it's actually within our power to bring it about, and it could have some dangerous implications. If what we're talking about is simply trying to increase pressures on the Chinese economy so that the Chinese economic stagnation is assured and locked in, I'm a lot more receptive to that sort of thing. Although even there, you got to be calibrated. And so I think that, certainly we would want to do things to make sure that the United States and or other democratic countries are sort of dominating the frontiers of technological innovation. And that may involve taking offensive measures to slow down China's technological development and make it harder for China to weaponize that technological development geopolitically. And so this is exactly what the United States has done to Huawei, by the way. The United States basically under two presidents has run a campaign to kneecap Huawei by denying it high-tech imports it needs and thereby prevent it from doing its global 5G rollout on the timeline envisioned. I think that sort of thing is entirely appropriate. Indeed, it'll be necessary for the United States to succeed in this competition. There are lots of more aggressive steps you could take to hasten China's economic descent into stagnation. It's not clear to me, though, that would be what you'd actually want to do. And so you could do a full-on tech boycott, embargo, whatever you want to call it, of China. You could impose much more draconian controls on trade with China in an effort to send it into an economic tailspin, leaving aside the fact that would have some pretty negative economic impacts for the United States, at least in the near term, and for many U.S. allies. It could actually catalyze exactly the sort of actions that you don't want to see. I mean, one of the things I think that Mike and I are cognizant of is that when the United States really got tough economically with Japan in the summer of 1941, that was when the countdown to war really began. And so I think what we're going to have to do is calibrate our approach to this. We're going to have to do things that prevent the CCP from establishing a lead or establishing dominance in key sectors that really matter to the future balance of economic and military power, without being so confrontational that we may convince Xi Jinping or those who follow him that there's really nothing to lose in provoking a bigger fight with the United States.
I would say one thing that the U.S. should do is try to shape the system around China as much as it's trying to. I actually think our ability to influence Chinese decision-making is somewhat limited beyond just simple deterrence in various areas. But one thing that the United States can do is try to orchestrate a system around China. So we've talked about a few aspects of that, this sort of loose economic bloc where the United States doesn't necessarily need to dominate across all aspects of the global economy. The basic idea is you're trying to create a range of alternatives to Chinese products and services so that China can't monopolize those key areas and lord it over other countries. You're trying to do the same thing in the ideological sphere where you don't necessarily need to replicate Jeffersonian democracies around the world, but you are trying to find ways to prevent the spread of these digital authoritarian technologies that are really degrading the overall level and quality of democracy around the world. And then at the same time, there's lots of things the United States shouldn't do. Hal mentioned some of them. I think, another thing that Hal briefly mentioned earlier are sort of symbolic moves that provoke China, but don't actually do anything to deter it. So like Nancy Pelosi's trip, I think is a good illustration of that, because if you're just talking loudly, but not building up the big stick, you're cruising for a bruise in there. So you need to make sure that you are actively avoiding a number of things. And I just worry that we're almost doing exactly the opposite. There's a lot of tough talk coming out of especially Capitol Hill right now, but not really the changes militarily that you'd want to see. The United States is increasingly squeezing China economically, but failing to deter it militarily. And that is exactly what the United States did vis-a-vis Imperial Japan. It wasn't just the oil embargo, it was the oil embargo with a complete lack of military preparation, such that we were completely asleep at the switch and the Japanese were able to come over to Pearl Harbor and pummel us. So, avoiding those kind of scenarios, if you're going to squeeze China economically, you better sure as hell deter it militarily. And why go down, why do things like rename TechPro and make it sound more like an embassy just to provoke and get the Chinese riled up? There's just a number of symbolic moves that I think could be set aside right now while we're in such a dangerous period.
I mean, obviously, throughout the book, you use the Cold War analogy as sort of a successful example of how to manage the danger zone. You might want to do a spin-off article about the unsuccessful examples as a counter to that, which is great. We have time for one more question. Let's go to Theodore Lenhart, who I think is a historical question. If you just introduce yourself and ask your question.
Nice to see you, Professor Brands, and Professor Beckley as well. I'm a former student of Professor Brands, I might add, so I always enjoy the opportunity to ask him another question. What can the United States learn to go to one of those unsuccessful instances from the Anglo-German danger zone in the lead up to World War I? And specifically, should the United States focus on deterrence through alliances, as Britain did in the Entente, or rather on flexibility and dialogue, as Britain also attempted with Germany at different moments in the lead up to 1914? And additionally, if the latter, in terms of dialogue, should the United States prioritize building trust on peripheral issues, as Britain to a degree attempted on colonial matters with Germany? Or should the two sides attempt to tackle the most divisive issues, as Britain and Germany failed to do on the naval arms race?
I mean, I'll take a crack at that. And Ted, good to see you again. I don't think it's necessarily a case of either or, right? And so I think that the United States has a no kidding capabilities problem in the Western Pacific right now. And so we're not going to be successful in deterring China from using force unless we deal with that challenge. At the same time, I think there's a lot of purposes that dialogue and discussion can serve, even if you don't expect that it's going to lead to a major breakthrough, right? It can be a way of understanding what the other side is thinking. It can be a way of reassuring your allies or your own domestic population that you're exhausting every opportunity for peace. It can be a way of just sort of making the competition a tiny bit safer at the margin so that you remain committed enough to it to win it. And so I don't think it's bad that, you know, President Biden is going to talk to Xi Jinping at the same time that we're going to be exploring ways of up-arming Taiwan more rapidly in the coming years, I would imagine. I will say, with respect to the issues that one would address, you know, I think one theory of the U.S.-China relationship was that you would focus on issues where there were common interests like climate, and that would have spillover effects for the rest of the relationship. Doesn't appear to be working that way right now. It appears actually that the issues of dispute are spoiling discussion of the issues where perhaps we have common interests, right? And so the Chinese shut down the climate dialogue, not that there was much going on in it. Anyways, if we're thinking about Taiwan in particular, though, my hunch is that if we get a modus vivendi, some degree of lasting stability in the Strait, at least at first, it's not going to be through a formal diplomatic agreement. It's going to be through sort of something more informal and tacit, where both sides realize that living with the status quo indefinitely, as frustrating as that is better than the alternatives. To get there, you've got to A, deter the Chinese from using force to overturn the status quo, and B, probably provide some degree of reassurance that we're not just putting Taiwan on a glide path toward independence, right? Which from the Chinese perspective would be a dramatic change in the status quo. But I think if that happens and we're successful in doing those things, maybe you get to a situation where there's a degree of accepted stability. Down the road, perhaps it's codified in the way that the situation in Berlin was in the 1971 agreement, or perhaps not. But that's generally going to be easier than sort of trying to formally tackle a situation that is this disputed.
Well, I promised we'd finish by 1 o'clock. It is 12:59. I also said I wouldn't make a Top Gun joke, but I can't help myself, which is, it sounds like what you're arguing for is rather than a highway to the danger zone, it's a highway through the danger zone. And how can we kind of make it through this fast stuff? At least I got a smirk, at least on screen. So,
well, it's more about the need for speed in U.S.-China policy right now. So.
Exactly. I'm sure your families appreciate both of you very much. So, Hal Brands, Mike Beckley, Danger Zone, Coming Conflict with China. Thank you so much for being here. Follow their work and hope to see everybody next time at our next talk. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Gabe. Appreciate it.